Judith Brenniger was a stay-at-home mother of 3.
She seemed like a real good mother.
And her husband, Robert, worked hard to support them.
He was really good to her.
But then Robert's son, Corey, made a tragic mistake.
He had accidentally shot his dad.
But was it the accident that Corey claimed?
I need help right away!
Or was it murder?
I had a gut feeling that there was something else.
The search for the truth would take almost 10 years.
I always just kept it inside.
Expose a shocking family secret.
He said, "Have you ever been tied down and beaten?"
And leave everyone wondering what kind of mother would turn a little boy into a weapon.
She is probably the most evil, wicked, despiteful person I have ever met.
Mark Center, Ohio, November 3rd, 2003. It was a quiet autumn afternoon in this tiny country crossroads, tucked amid the corn and soybean fields of western Ohio.
If you blink your eyes, you've already went through it.
Of course, most afternoons are quiet in Mark Center.
There used to be a little store there, but then that closed up.
But that afternoon, Mark Center's peaceful silence was suddenly shattered when one of its 400 residents picked up the phone and dialed 911.
911. I need help right away!
The sheriff's office received a 911 call from a very distraught-sounding young boy.
The operator did her best to calm the boy down, but he apparently had good reason to be distraught.
What's the problem there, sweetie? Okay. My dad was looking at Gunny. What happened, honey? Calm down.
In fact, it sounded as if the boy had accidentally shot his father.
It was unclear exactly what had happened.
But the result was tragic.
Can you tell if he's breathing, sweetheart? He's not breathing? Okay.
The operator dispatched emergency personnel to the scene, and when Cliff Vandermark with the Defiance County Sheriff's Office first arrived, he was met at the door by the caller, a 10-year-old boy.
He was standing there bawling, very emotional, and he had a phone in his hand.
The boy's name was Corey Brenniger.
I remember when Cliff got there, he'd grabbed me and told me to show him where my dad was.
But when Vandermark stepped into the bedroom that Corey indicated, the sheriff's office veteran quickly realized that the boy's father, 34-year-old Robert Brenniger, was beyond help.
I remember him saying, "Oh no, he's gone."
But as soon as I opened the door, at that point I knew.
Corey's father had been shot once in the head.
There was a bullet hole that entered on the left side next to the right side.
There was an extensive amount of blood and tissue on the right side and on the bed and on the wall.
And the gun that killed him lay close by.
There was a .410 shotgun laying on the floor next to the bed.
But was it the accident that the little boy claimed? Something about Robert Brenniger's body didn't seem right.
He was laying on his back. He had bed covers up to his waist.
I had a gut feeling that there was something else to this case.
And the search for the truth would end up revealing a terrible family secret, one that Judith tried to keep hidden for years. Born in 1967, Judith was a native of Southwest Ohio, part of a large farming family.
We had lots of brothers and sisters. We had cows and horses.
However, Judith's childhood on the farm was far from idyllic. When she was only 3 years old, a tragic accident almost took her life.
The neighbor's daughter was learning how to drive. When the girl went to back out, she thought she was running over our dog, and it was Judy.
The accident shattered the bones in both of Judith's legs.
She wore braces for a long time.
Judith's legs eventually healed, but her parents' marriage fell apart. They divorced when Judith was still a little girl, and her mother remarried.
Our stepdad was a roofer.
Judith remained close to her father, though, and at 17, she left school and Ohio to live with him in Arizona.
She drops out of school before she graduates.
Judith wasn't in Arizona long, though.
She met a guy out there in the military, and she moved to Alaska for a while.
And when that didn't work out, Judith eventually drifted back to Ohio, where barely 20, she had no trouble hooking up with a new man, Scott Carwile.
She was this blonde bombshell, the dimples and the smile, and she was just adorable.
Judith and Scott married in 1991 and had a daughter together. But by 94, the marriage was over.
They eventually got divorced.
And by the late 90s, Judith was 30 years old and raising a daughter on her own. But she would soon have another shot at the stability that had always been missing from her life. In 1998, she met Robert Breniger. Born and raised in the small town of Hicksville, Ohio, Robert was a country boy through and through.
Robert was a big hunter.
He'd look forward every fall to deer season coming in.
Like Judith, he had a child from a previous marriage. Although according to Judith's sister, she saw that as a plus.
She kept calling me and telling me, oh, she met a really nice guy, and they had went out to dinner a couple times, and that he had a little boy.
Corey was 5 years old when his father started dating Judith.
She seemed like a pretty cool lady, like she was fun. She was joking around with me and being real nice.
Robert's mother agreed.
I liked her. She seemed like a real good mother to her daughter.
And with his son and mother's approval, it wasn't long before Robert asked Judith to marry him, and she said yes.
She was real happy, and he was really good to her.
Judith and Robert soon settled into the rural Ohio version of the good life.
They bought a double-wide trailer and had it placed on one extra lot that I had in Mark Center.
Once settled in, Judith stayed home, raising not just Corey and her daughter, but the couple's new baby boy.
She was always doing things for them kids. She just loved being a mother.
Robert, meanwhile, worked maintenance at a local steel mill.
He was an extremely hard worker, worked like extremely long hours.
He worked all the overtime he could. He might only have 2 or 3 days off in the whole month.
Sometimes he would just sleep on a cot at work.
And even when he was at home, he often slept during the day in order to work the night shift.
He would sleep with earplugs in.
Although even then, Judith did her best to keep the kids quiet, or at least out of her husband's way.
Judy was always taking the kids outside. She always kept them busy doing something so he could sleep.
It wasn't an easy life, but Judith appeared to be happy.
She loved Robert to no end. I mean, he was so good to her and the kids.
And as for Robert?
He seemed happy, was happy they had found somebody again to share his life with.
However, there was at least one person in the household who appeared unhappy. Robert's little boy, Corey. Corey and his father had always been close.
Corey was always right by his side, always.
However, the divorce settlement also meant that Corey spent some time with his mother and other relatives too. And according to Judith's sister, that was a problem.
When Robert went and picked him up one time, he brought Corey in, he was all upset. He said, never again. He's never going over there again.
But in 2001, Corey's mother had eventually given up custody of the little boy, allowing Judith to adopt him.
She had my dad come and pick me up one day, and then she said that she was going to adopt me, and I was kind of treated like one of the family.
Although according to Judith's sister, she had her work cut out for her when it came to raising Corey.
He was a little unruly.
And since Robert worked such long hours, it was Judith who had to deal with him.
She would tell my dad to discipline me, and he would say, I don't want to, you do it.
As a result, Corey spent many an afternoon in timeout.
We would go over and pick my daughter up, my second wife and I, and it seemed like every time Corey was in that chair being disciplined.
Exactly what Corey had done, Judith's ex and his wife weren't sure.
She just told me that he wasn't like the rest of the kids.
She said I was a problem child.
Was he simply having trouble adjusting to his new family? Or was Corey struggling with a more serious problem?
He was quiet and withdrawn.
I can't even tell you 5 words that Corey ever spoke.
He didn't smile. You never really saw him enjoying himself.
Whatever the reason for Corey's unhappiness, by the time he turned 10, Robert was planning to take some time out from his busy schedule in hopes of reconnecting with his troubled son.
Robert wanted him to go deer hunting with him, you know, just like his father did him.
They were going to take a hunter safety course.
And even before the class, on the evening of November 2nd, 2003, Robert had taken Corey out behind the trailer to familiarize his son with a .410 gauge shotgun that had belonged to his grandfather.
And they were out target practicing. You know, he was letting him shoot the gun.
But within 24 hours of that informal lesson, the 10-year-old would make a tragic mistake. On the afternoon of November 3rd, 2003, in the tiny rural crossroads of Mark Center, Ohio, 10-year-old Corey Brenniger called 911 and reported that he just accidentally shot his father. Cliff Vandermark with the Defiance County Sheriff's Office was the first responder on the scene.
I had Corey stay back, and I went to the bedroom.
And when he did, Vandermark found Corey's father, 34-year-old Robert Brenniger, dead from a single gunshot wound to the head.
Lieutenant Vandermark immediately took the boy away from that scene.
I took Corey outside, and we sat down on the front porch.
Sitting on the porch, the 10-year-old did his best to explain what happened.
Corey told me that he had accidentally shot his dad. He was going back there with a gun to talk about hunting.
He was handing him the gun, and the gun went off.
Mostly, though, Vandermark simply held the little boy while he cried.
I didn't do a lot of questioning. He was pretty distraught at the point. It was very emotional for me also.
Police officers were very nice, very kind towards me.
Rather than question the little boy, once the EMTs arrived on the scene to look after Corey, Vandermark concentrated on contacting his adoptive mother, Judith.
She was at a garage sale at her mother's house. She arrived at the scene probably about 20 minutes after I was there.
When Judith got there, she was kind of hysterical.
Understandably, the newly widowed mother's first instinct wasn't her dead husband. It was her son.
She showed up and took charge of Corey, basically.
She came and says, I want to get him away from the scene. Made sense to me. I mean, you know, I didn't want that little boy to suffer any more than what he'd already suffered.
So within 30 minutes of the shooting, Corey and his mother were on their way to his grandmother's house, while the sheriff's office started a routine investigation into what they believed to be an accidental shooting.
There were photographs taken and some evidence gathered, but it wasn't really treated as a homicide scene.
After all, not only did the little boy seem genuinely distraught about his father's death, there was some evidence inside the bedroom that appeared to confirm his story.
The boy, at that point, said that he had been talking to his dad about hunting and guns, and there were what appeared to be some kind of gun safety pamphlets on the bed near the body.
However, even a cursory examination of the scene revealed a few things that were troubling. For starters, there was where Robert Brenniger had died.
He was laying in bed at the time.
In a very, for lack of a better term, peaceful position.
Even more suspicious was the fact that Robert, who worked the graveyard shift and slept during the day, was still wearing his earplugs.
Why would you have earplugs in if you're having a conversation about gun safety or hunting?
Taken together, the position of the body and the fact that Robert was wearing earplugs led at least some of the investigators to wonder, was Corey telling the truth? Or had his father been asleep when the shot was fired?
Some of the deputies questioned whether it could have happened quite that way. There were definitely some things about the scene that did not really match up with an accidental shooting.
However, despite their reservations, the investigators hesitated to take their suspicions to the next step.
To suggest that somehow this boy had purposely shot his dad, there was just no reason at that point to go there.
Who's going to believe that a child would kill their parent?
The lead investigator, Detective Vandermark, certainly didn't.
I believe this child that there was an accident.
He was relying almost exclusively on the boy's explanation, the boy's statement.
And the other investigators at the scene simply followed his lead.
He had a lot of experience, and he basically persuaded the other folks that had some questions about the physical scene.
I couldn't believe that a 10-year-old could have done anything else but be in an accident.
And when the file on the case was closed, his first impression became the official one.
The sheriff's office was adamant this was an accidental shooting.
The official ruling appeared to satisfy the family.
It accidentally discharged. I had always felt that as he came into the bedroom, he had tripped on the rug.
And he dropped the gun, that it went off when the butt hit the floor.
Besides, the family already had its hands full, dealing with the aftermath of Robert's sudden death.
Everything was chaotic. I comforted Judy as much as I could because she was very upset, naturally.
She was so depressed. She just wanted to lay in bed. It's like she had nothing to live for.
And things were even worse for 10-year-old Corey.
Every night, I would wake up, it didn't matter, always thinking about it. I mean, I could be in school and it would just hit me. I mean, it affected me every day.
Friends and family did their best to comfort the little boy.
I would hug him and tell him, it's going to be okay. It was an accident.
And even law enforcement tried to look out for him.
I actually stopped by a couple times just to check on Corey because I felt so bad for the young man.
Judith did eventually pull herself together, though. Not long after the shooting, she and the 3 kids left Mark Center.
We moved quite a bit.
And after a year or two, Judith started dating again.
She was seeing guys here and there.
Eventually, she even remarried, becoming Judith Hawkey and losing touch with her former in-laws.
Judith and I kind of disconnected. We didn't have any argument or anything like that. It was just that she made it kind of clear that she didn't want me around, and I felt that it would be better for Corey that if I wasn't coming and interfering and causing irritation in the household.
Over time, Corey did attempt to move past the tragedy.
He seemed like he was trying to block the whole thing out.
But there was no avoiding the rumors about the shooting that regularly circulated among his classmates.
The rumors that it happened while they were hunting, it happened while he was explaining gun safety. The only thing you knew was the gun went off and it killed his father.
As a result, Corey became even more withdrawn.
He had written a biography of sorts for a school teacher describing that no one would understand what his life was like.
And there was trouble at home, too.
I actually moved out at the end of my junior year.
Corey moved in with a friend's family and managed, more or less, to struggle through his senior year.
He started acting out, doing a lot of crazy stuff at school.
Including one instance that few of his classmates would ever forget. It was during shop class when several students were chatting to pass the time while working on their projects.
Talking about things, I have it this bad at home, and another kid would say, well, I have it this good or bad at home.
Corey, at the back of the classroom, was strangely silent during the discussion, until suddenly...
Corey says, you guys don't have a clue.
And when one of his cockier classmates asked Corey to prove it, his reply left them speechless.
He said, have you ever been tied down and beaten?
By the spring of 2012, it had been almost 9 years since Judith Hawkey's husband, Robert Brenniger, had been shot and killed by his 10-year-old son, Corey, in the family's Defiance County, Ohio home.
It was pretty much accepted that it was accidental.
That was the official ruling, but there were lingering rumors and questions about the shooting.
There was just something odd about it.
And Corey had clearly been haunted by something ever since his father's death, some secret behind the shooting.
There were a few instances where I almost came out and told a teacher and a friend.
Including one instance in shop class during his senior year when he'd hinted at the possibility that he'd been abused.
You could tell by the emotion in his face, the tears in his eyes, the welling up of his breath. He wasn't making this stuff up.
Was abuse the real reason that Corey had shot his father? When the teacher spoke to him privately after class, Corey had shrugged it off.
I said, well, then we need to do something about this. It's been so long ago, it's not worth doing anything about.
And after that, he never really spoke of it again.
I always just kept it inside.
However, that March, another teacher would finally get through to the troubled teen. It was a warm spring evening, not long before graduation, when Corey dropped by a high school softball game.
I ran into my old gym teacher. Her daughter was playing, and I hadn't seen her in a few years, so we got to talking.
This was somebody that he trusted and that he felt comfortable with.
So comfortable, in fact, that he started discussing his troubles at home.
I told her that I had moved out of Judith's house and I was out on my own. I was staying with one of my friends.
But then, as Corey opened up, the conversation took a darker turn.
She actually looked at me and said, I know it's not the truth about what happened to your dad.
Corey was stunned. After years of rumors, someone had come right out and said it.
The shock hit me and I started crying.
His world was really breaking down around him because he had kept this inside for so long.
And after almost 9 years of keeping the secret locked inside,
I told her the truth.
The truth was so explosive that Corey's teacher immediately contacted the authorities. And when he got to school the next morning, they were waiting.
I was called down to the office and Cliff was there.
It had been almost 9 years since Cliff Vandermark, now a lieutenant with the Defiance County Sheriff's Office, had sat on that front porch with the frightened little boy who just shot his father.
What happened that day was, to be real honest, there was things that I overlooked because I allowed the emotion to control me that day.
But almost 9 years later in the principal's office, Corey finally confessed what many had long suspected.
Corey told me that he had intentionally shot his father.
I was scared. I was relieved. There was so much going through my head.
Lieutenant Vandermark was shaken by the revelation, but he was also determined to uncover the entire truth.
I had a lot of questions to ask. We went through and talked about it. He told me about some severe abuse.
According to Corey, the abuse had led directly to his father's death. However, in a second stunning admission, he revealed that his father hadn't been the abuser. Instead, he claimed that it was Judith.
He came out and said, she made me do it.
His story was that he had been forced and coerced by her to shoot his dad.
Corey claimed that it was hardly the first thing Judith had forced him to do either. In fact, he made his adoptive mother sound more like an evil stepmother.
She would make me do all the housework. I was basically a maid or a slave.
And if he didn't?
She wouldn't feed me.
That was hardly the worst of what Corey described, though.
The amount of abuse and really torture was horrific.
She would beat me with a belt. She was burning my genitals with a lighter.
And his half-brother and Judith's daughter, did they suffer the same sort of abuse? Not according to Corey.
They were treated better because they were actually her kids, whereas I was adopted.
Corey also claimed that he'd never told anyone about Judith's abuse.
She had so much control over him, he was in fear of her.
Fear and control that allowed Judith to keep her abuse well hidden, according to Corey.
She would make me wear long-sleeve turtlenecks to school to cover up all the marks and bruises.
In fact, Corey said that Judith even managed to hide the abuse from his father.
She never disciplined me in front of my father.
But how did she convince him to kill his father? The answer, if what Corey told the authorities was true, may have been the most twisted part of the entire tale.
Judith told me that my dad had cancer.
Judith told Corey his dad was in tons of pain. His dad really wanted somebody to end that pain for him.
Corey was so brainwashed by what he had been told that he felt that he was actually helping out his dad.
Finally, after recounting what he claimed was the true story of his father's death, the 19-year-old wrapped up his disturbing tale with a single question for Lieutenant Vandermark.
Corey looked at me and says, "Am I going to jail now?"
He believed that it was all his fault. He assumed he was going to jail.
I had to look at him and said, "I don't know what's going to happen."
And then Lieutenant Vandermark told Corey something else, something the teenager desperately needed to hear.
He said he believed me.
Of course, Vandermark had believed Corey before, back in 2003, when the 10-year-old told him the shooting had been an accident.
I got caught up in the emotion as an investigator, which oftentimes we shouldn't.
And he was determined not to make the same mistake twice.
It was important to us after we left there to go back and revisit everything to corroborate what he was saying.
As a result, the investigators spent the better part of a year trying to verify Corey's story.
There was over 80 people that we interviewed.
Among them were several of Corey's old teachers from elementary school.
There were several teachers who noticed that he would be wearing long sleeves and turtlenecks and clothing that was really inappropriate for hot weather.
We actually found a teacher that had a drawing of his face when he was in second grade with bruises on it.
The school officials would contact Judith about what they observed, and she, of course, would say it was nothing.
When the investigators questioned Robert Brenniger's mother, she also remembered something peculiar about Corey's childhood. The way that whenever the family was together, Judith was always hovering in the background, keeping an eye on Corey.
She wouldn't let me out of her sight.
I was never in a room alone with Corey.
Robert's mother hadn't thought anything of it at the time. But in hindsight, the explanation seemed obvious.
So that there was no chance that he would ever tell me what was going on.
And when the investigators interviewed Judith's ex-husband, he told them that while he'd never witnessed Judith abusing their daughter, she'd gotten violent with him on numerous occasions.
I had things thrown at me. I was struck in my sleep. She would constantly slap me in the face.
However, that wasn't all he told the investigators. Judith's ex may have never witnessed her abusing their daughter, but he did claim that when she babysat other children, her approach to discipline had been exceedingly harsh.
She would punish them by setting them on chairs for hours, stare at walls, drill sergeant type discipline.
But had the drill sergeant turned her adopted son into a killer? After a year of investigation, the authorities were convinced. And on March 7th, 2013, almost 10 years after the shooting that killed her husband, the Defiance County authorities placed Judith under arrest for murder.
My oldest sister called me and said, "Oh my God, it's all over the news. They arrested Judy today." I said, "For what?" And when she told me, I was like, "What? No way. No way."
Corey Brenniger was not arrested, though, despite admitting to pulling the trigger.
The reason that Corey wasn't charged was because at the time this offense was committed, he was 10 years old. And we strongly believe that Corey was forced to do this.
Corey would have his day in court, though. As the state's star witness against Judith, their entire case was built around his account of the shooting and the abuse that led up to it.
It come down to his credibility. We had to show that Corey was telling the truth.
On Monday, October 28, 2013, Judith Hawkey went on trial in Defiance County, Ohio. The 46-year-old was charged with murder for her role in the 2003 shooting death of her husband, Robert Brenniger.
It took about 10 years to actually get from the shooting to the trial.
And that was largely due to the fact that Corey had waited almost 9 years to come forward and admit that the shooting wasn't the accident that he'd initially claimed.
Judith had made me walk into my dad's room and shoot him in the head.
He had carried that secret for all those years.
But why would Judith make Corey shoot his father? According to the prosecution's opening statement, it was for a very simple reason: money.
There was around $332,000 in insurance money.
She had also collected the death benefits from Robert's Social Security,
which pushes it close to $1 million.
She certainly had a financial motive.
And according to the prosecutors, she had wasted no time collecting either.
She had, within less than about 12 hours after the shooting, gone to process a claim for life insurance.
But while the prosecution claimed that Judith's motive to murder Robert was easy to understand, the way she had carried it out was almost unimaginable, turning a 10-year-old child into a weapon.
It's a murder case, but this is a case about child abuse, first and foremost.
Among the first witnesses the prosecution called was a child psychologist.
She indicated that Corey was absolutely believable.
A 10-year-old boy would pretty much do whatever that abusive adult was telling them to do.
The psychologist also said that it wasn't surprising that it took years for the truth to come out.
It's not unusual for young adults to disclose things that had happened to them when they were younger.
The prosecutors claimed that Corey carried the physical scars of his abuse too, and they had a witness to testify to it.
He was interviewed and examined by a medical doctor, a child abuse expert, who did find scarring on his genital area,
which, in the expert's opinion, corresponded to Corey's claim that Judith had burned him with a lighter.
She had believed that he was telling the truth.
But would the jury believe Corey? Because the prosecution's entire case against Judith hinged on his testimony.
We were very concerned about whether he emotionally would be able to handle getting up there and having to talk about this again.
And with so much riding on his performance, Corey was understandably nervous when he took the stand.
It was going to be an uphill battle, but I stayed on my course and hoped for the best.
However, even as he testified against her, he couldn't bring himself to look at the woman sitting at the defense table.
I couldn't look at her. Fear would just prevent me from ever being able to face her.
Corey never once looked at Judith, but he slowly, carefully explained just why he feared her so much in excruciating detail.
He described being placed in a bathtub of very cold water and being shoved down in the bathtub.
She beat me and hit me whenever she could.
She had threatened to cut off his penis and put a knife to his genitals.
I was shocked. I was angry that my grandson had to go through all this pain.
And according to Corey, he'd gone through it for years.
She had to condition Corey to a point of control, and that's what she did. She gained complete control through fear.
And then, once he'd been properly conditioned,
she had told him initially that his dad had a brain tumor and needed to be shot and put out of his misery.
That he was worried about being able to support the family after his death, and that if he committed suicide, there would not be insurance payout.
Corey said that he had agreed to do what his adoptive mother asked.
It really didn't matter whether he was sick or not. I still had to do what Judith said.
And then, fighting back tears, he told the spellbound courtroom just how he had killed his father. According to Corey, Judith had been waiting for him when he got off the school bus on the afternoon of November 3rd, 2003.
She told me today was the day, and that the gun was in the lodge room.
Then, once she explained what she wanted him to do, Judith had taken the other two children to the garage sale, leaving him alone with his father.
My dad was asleep at the time, so I was just supposed to take the gun in there and make it look like an accident.
Fighting back tears, Corey told the jury how he had crept into the room where his father slept.
I was close to breaking a few times.
But in the end, he managed to get the story out, how he'd essentially executed his sleeping father.
As soon as he had shot his father, he could hear him gurgling and he knew he was dying.
Next, according to Corey, he'd placed several hunting and gun safety pamphlets on the bed beside his dying father, picked up the phone, and dialed 911.
When I called 911, I told him the story that Judith made me recite and remember.
It was powerful testimony, so it was no surprise that when it was the defense's turn, they focused their efforts on attacking Corey's credibility, starting with his claims of abuse.
They offered some pictures of Corey with siblings and that sort of thing as a boy and as a young teenager and so on. Some happy pictures at the fair or wherever.
I would go out and visit with Judy and the kids. We'd make popcorn, pizza, whatever, and we'd all cuddle up on the couch under a blanket and watch TV, watch movies. I see no signs of anything.
And if he had suffered abuse, the defense claimed it had happened at the hands of someone else before Judith adopted him.
I believe that is why he was so believable to the psychologist, because it actually happened to him, but it wasn't her. He had transferred the blame to Judy.
And Corey's claims about the shooting, the defense argued that was a lie too.
Law enforcement had concluded that this was an accident and they got it right.
The defense also claimed that it was no coincidence that Corey had waited until his mother remarried to accuse her of murder.
They said that Corey was jealous of his new stepfather.
He just didn't understand about moving on and having a relationship, I guess, with somebody. And I think it was just so shocking to him when she did get married.
That wasn't the only reason Corey had been angry with Judith either, according to the defense.
She didn't give him some of the Social Security money and life insurance benefits. She did really limit his access to finances through his teenage years.
And according to the defense, between his anger over Judith's marriage and the feeling that she'd somehow cheated him of his share of his father's estate, Corey had decided to make a false accusation against Judith.
There was some suggestion that he was out to punish her.
And no matter what the defense said, there was still a chance that he might. Because when the case went to the jury on November 8th, the decision still hinged on one thing.
To convict Judith, they had to believe Corey. There was no way around it.
On November 8th, 2013, the jury in Judith Hawkey's murder trial announced it had just reached a verdict. The 46-year-old was accused of masterminding the 2003 murder of her husband, Robert Brenniger, at the hands of his then 10-year-old son, Corey.
We had to get the jury to make that leap. They had to see that she manipulated and controlled this child to a point that he walked into a room and took a shotgun and put it inches away from his dad, hadn't pulled the trigger.
But had they asked too much of the jury? It had taken barely 2 hours to reach a verdict.
I was a little concerned, like if it comes back that quickly, that they just didn't believe, the case as we had presented it.
It was a bitter disappointment for Corey.
I remember my heart just sinking.
And then, when the verdict was announced,
I just instantly lost. I started crying.
The verdict was guilty as to all counts.
Judith and her family were just as stunned as Corey, although for far different reasons.
We just couldn't believe it. I just thought, oh my God, how? How could they believe the story?
Although if anyone had any doubts, they may have been erased as the bailiffs escorted Judith from the courtroom.
She was making lunging attempts to get at me.
Corey wouldn't have to fear Judith any longer, though. On December 19th, the judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
When she was sentenced, I just felt like my life could start. I would never have to look behind me to see if she was back there.
But he will forever be haunted by what she made him do.
That young man shuts his eyes every day and sees the death of his father.
And for many, that's what makes Judith's crime so disturbing. Not only did she murder her husband, she almost destroyed her adopted son, too.
In the 33 years that I've been working, I never, ever had a case like this where somebody would take a 10-year-old child and use them as an instrument of death.
She is probably the most evil, wicked person I have ever met. Do I feel that she got what she deserved? Not yet.
On the morning of January 6th, 1980, Palermo awoke to what should have been an ordinary Sunday. The Christmas season had not quite faded from the city, and Epiphany was a day when many families prepared to attend church together before returning home to share a quiet meal. Streets that only hours earlier had been calm were beginning to fill with people heading toward places of worship. Nothing about that morning suggested that it would soon become one of the darkest turning points in modern Italian history. Inside one home, Pier Santi Mattarella was preparing to leave with his family. He was not on his way to a political meeting. There were no campaign speeches scheduled, no parliamentary debates awaiting him, no public ceremonies planned for the day. Like countless other fathers throughout Sicily, he was simply getting ready to attend church. His vehicle was a Fiat 132. Seated with him were members of his family, his wife, his daughter, and his mother-in-law. It was an ordinary family outing, the kind of routine that repeats itself so often that no one imagines it could become historic. The car pulled away from the residence. Then, in only a matter of seconds, everything changed. As the Fiat had barely begun its journey, a lone gunman approached the driver's side. He carried a .38 caliber handgun. Without hesitation, he moved close to the vehicle and fired multiple shots at point-blank range. The bullet struck Pier Santi Mattarella in the head and chest. The attack was swift. It was precise. It was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The gunman did not linger. He immediately fled to a waiting getaway car, where an accomplice was already prepared to drive away from the scene. Within moments, the attackers had disappeared, leaving behind confusion, horror, and a family whose ordinary Sunday had been transformed into unimaginable tragedy. As news of the shooting spread, another member of the Mattarella family rushed toward the scene. Sergio Mattarella, Pier Santi's younger brother, reached the car and desperately tried to pull his wounded brother from the driver's seat. The effort was frantic, driven by the hope that there might still be time to save him. There wasn't. Despite every attempt to reach medical assistance, Pier Santi Mattarella died shortly afterward from his wounds. The image captured that morning, Sergio Mattarella supporting his dying brother, would become one of the most enduring photographs in the history of Italy's struggle against organized crime. It was not merely a record of grief. It became a symbol of a nation confronting the human cost of violence that had long operated in the shadows. At first glance, the assassination appeared to be another political killing during one of Italy's most turbulent decades. The country was living through what became known as the Years of Lead, a period marked by political extremism, terrorism, bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations carried out by groups from both the far left and the far right. Public officials, judges, journalists, and law enforcement officers often lived under the constant awareness that violence could arrive without warning. Against that backdrop, the murder of a prominent regional politician might have seemed like one more chapter in a larger story of instability. But investigators would eventually discover that this crime belonged to a different story. Altogether, it was a story rooted not in ideological extremism, but in power. It was a story about influence measured not through elections, but through fear. It was a story about an organization that had quietly woven itself into the political and economic fabric of Sicily for decades. That organization was Cosa Nostra. For years, Sicily had existed under two systems of authority. One was visible. It consisted of elected officials, public offices, government institutions, and courts. The other was largely invisible. Its decisions were made behind closed doors. Its authority depended not upon laws, but upon intimidation. Its influence reached businesses, public contracts, construction projects, and political relationships. It rarely announced itself openly, yet its presence was understood by many. Most people simply learned to live with that reality. Some accommodated it. Some feared it. Very few challenged it directly. Pier Santa Mattarella was one of those few. His efforts to reform Sicily's regional government and remove organized crime from public administration would eventually place him on a collision course with interests far more powerful than many outside the island could fully appreciate. According to testimony that would emerge years later from former members of the mafia itself, the leadership of Cosa Nostra came to see him not as a politician with different ideas, but as a threat to their financial interests and long-established influence. If those accounts were true, then the attack on that January morning had not been spontaneous. It had been decided long before the gunman ever stepped toward the driver's side of the Fiat. Yet that realization only deepened the mystery. Because even after decades of investigations, court proceedings, witness testimony, and renewed forensic examinations, some of the most important questions have never received definitive answers. Who made the final decision to eliminate Pier Santa Mattarella? How was the operation planned? Who stood behind the escape car? Most importantly, who fired the fatal shots? The answers have never been entirely straightforward. Investigators initially pursued one direction before ultimately turning toward another. Witnesses described a highly professional attack. Early suspicion fell upon extremist groups active during the years of lead. Later, former mafia members provided accounts that fundamentally changed the course of the investigation. Their testimony pointed toward the Sicilian Mafia Commission, alleging that the assassination had been approved collectively by some of the most powerful leaders within Cosa Nostra. Even then, uncertainty remained. Different insiders identified different gunmen. Their accounts agreed on the existence of conspiracy, but disagreed on the identity of the man who actually pulled the trigger. Physical evidence never resolved the contradiction. Court judgments would eventually establish responsibility for ordering the murder, but not with complete certainty regarding the individual assassin. That unresolved question has remained alive for decades. Even in recent years, Italian authorities have continued examining preserved evidence, searching for scientific answers that earlier generations of investigators could not obtain. Modern DNA analysis was expected to provide clarity where witness testimony had left uncertainty. Instead, it produced another disappointment. No usable DNA evidence capable of identifying the shooter was found. Nearly half a century after that quiet Sunday morning in Palermo, the murder of Pier Santa Mattarella remains both a solved case and an unsolved one. The courts concluded that senior mafia leaders had ordered his death. History recognizes his assassination as a defining moment in Italy's fight against organized crime. Yet the identity of the man who stood beside the driver's door with a .38 caliber revolver remains uncertain. This is not simply the story of a political assassination. It is the story of a reformer who challenged entrenched power, a murder that reshaped Italy's confrontation with Cosa Nostra, in an investigation that uncovered answers only after years of persistence, while leaving one final mystery unresolved. To understand why Pier Santi Mattarella died on that January morning, we must first understand the Sicily he was trying to change. To understand why Pier Santi Mattarella became the target of one of the most consequential political assassinations in modern Italian history, it is necessary to look beyond the morning of January 6, 1980. His death cannot be separated from the role he chose to play, the reforms he pursued, or the environment in which those reforms unfolded. The attack that ended his life lasted only a few seconds, but the circumstances that led to it had been developing for years. They were rooted in the complex relationship between politics, public administration, and organized crime in Sicily during the 1970s. Pier Santi Mattarella was born on May 24, 1935, in Sicily. He came from a family deeply involved in public life and politics, one associated with Italy's Christian Democracy Party. Growing up in such an environment meant that political affairs were not distant events reported in newspapers. They formed part of everyday conversation and public responsibility. His family's involvement in government placed him close to the institutions that shaped post-war Italy, but it also exposed him to the realities of governing one of the country's most complicated regions. Sicily occupied a unique position within Italy. Rich in history and culture, the island had long possessed a strong regional identity. Yet alongside its legitimate political institutions existed another structure of influence that was neither elected nor officially recognized. Over decades, the Sicilian Mafia, known as Cosa Nostra, had established itself as a powerful force capable of influencing economic activity and public life in ways that extended far beyond ordinary criminal enterprises. By the time Mattarella entered regional leadership, this hidden system of power had become deeply intertwined with significant areas of Sicily's economy. Public construction projects, housing developments, infrastructure investments, and the allocation of regional funding represented enormous financial opportunities. These sectors did not merely determine how roads, buildings, and public works were constructed. They controlled where substantial amounts of public money would be spent and who would profit from that spending. According to later investigations and testimony, these were precisely the sectors in which Cosa Nostra exercised considerable influence throughout the 1970s. Construction contracts could determine fortunes. Housing projects generated continuous streams of revenue. Infrastructure spending created opportunities for businesses favored by organized crime. Regional funding became another source of economic and political leverage. This environment created a system in which public office and private criminal interests could intersect. While elected governments formally approved policies and budgets, criminal organizations sought to influence the practical distribution of those resources. The result was not simply illegal enrichment, but the gradual erosion of public institutions themselves. Against this backdrop, Pier Santi Mattarella assumed office as president of the Sicilian region in 1978. His election represented more than a routine political transition. It introduced a leadership style focused on institutional reform rather than accommodation. Instead of accepting existing administrative practices, Mattarella sought to reshape them according to principles of transparency and legality. One of his central objectives was to increase transparency in public procurement. Government contracts involve the expenditure of public funds, making them essential to the functioning of regional administration. Transparency within that process reduces opportunities for corruption, favoritism, and hidden financial arrangements. By advocating clearer procedures and greater accountability, Mattarella challenged practices that had benefited powerful interests for years. Another major priority involved the construction industry. Construction occupied a particularly important position within Sicily's economy. Roads, public housing, administrative buildings, and infrastructure projects required enormous investment, according to the information later gathered by investigators. These projects had become areas where organized crime exercised substantial influence. Mattarella sought to end that influence by reducing opportunities for manipulation within the contracting process. His reforms also extended to regional planning regulations. Rather than allowing Sicily to continue operating under looser standards that created opportunities for abuse, he aimed to align regional planning procedures with those applied elsewhere in Italy. On paper, such administrative reforms might appear technical or bureaucratic. In practice, they threatened systems through which considerable financial benefits had long been obtained. Administrative rules rarely attract widespread public attention. Yet changes in those rules can dramatically alter who receives contracts, who gains access to public investment, and who loses long-established advantages. By attempting to modernize regional governance, Mattarella was not merely introducing new regulations. He was altering the balance of power surrounding public money. Perhaps his broadest objective was to remove the influence of Cosa Nostra from regional institutions. Altogether, this goal distinguished his administration from approaches that simply addressed isolated incidents of corruption. Instead of treating individual cases separately, Mattarella pursued reforms aimed at strengthening the institutions themselves. If successful, those reforms would reduce opportunities for criminal organizations to influence government decision-making through political relationships or economic pressure. The consequences of such policies extended well beyond administrative procedure. Every canceled project represented financial losses for someone. Every investigation into corruption threatened established networks. Every procurement decision based upon transparent standards reduced opportunities for favoritism. Every attempt to enforce stricter planning regulations narrowed the space within which organized criminal interests could operate. Over time, these actions accumulated. According to later testimony from former members of Cosa Nostra who chose to cooperate with investigators, the mafia leadership viewed Mattarella's program not simply as political reform, but as a direct challenge to its economic interests. The issue was not personal disagreement or ideological conflict. Rather, his policies threatened revenue streams connected to public construction, infrastructure investment, housing developments, and regional spending. As his administration continued, Mattarella reportedly took concrete steps that reinforced this perception. He canceled projects considered suspicious. He supported investigations into corruption. He interrupted financial arrangements that depended upon questionable public contracts. He refused to provide political protection for businesses linked to mafia interests. Each decision represented an exercise of lawful governmental authority. Yet each also increased the pressure upon those who had benefited from existing practices. For observers outside Sicily, these administrative actions might have appeared routine. Governments everywhere review contracts, investigate corruption, and revise regulations. Within the specific political and economic environment of Sicily during the late 1970s, however, such measures carried far greater significance. Where organized crime derives influence from public spending, administrative reform can become a direct threat. Where criminal organizations depend upon predictable access to contracts, transparent procurement changes the rules entirely. Where corruption relies upon political cooperation, officials unwilling to cooperate become obstacles. The conflict that developed around Mattarella, therefore, reflected more than disagreement over public policy. It represented competing visions of how authority itself should function within Sicily. One vision placed government institutions at the center of public administration, operating according to legal standards intended to serve the broader public interest. The other depended upon informal influence exercised outside those institutions, where economic benefits could be directed through relationships inaccessible to ordinary citizens. As these competing systems increasingly collided, the political atmosphere surrounding Mattarella grew more dangerous. The evidence establishing this deterioration did not emerge immediately. Much of what became known about the internal discussions within Cosa Nostra surfaced only years later through the testimony of pentiti, former mafia members who decided to cooperate with judicial authorities. According to those later accounts, senior mafia leaders concluded that Mattarella had become a serious threat. His reforms endangered financial interests connected to public works. His investigations threatened corrupt arrangements. His refusal to protect businesses associated with organized crime undermined established expectations regarding political cooperation. Most importantly, his broader effort to remove mafia influence from regional government challenged the organization's long-term position within Sicily itself. If these testimonies accurately reflected the internal deliberations of Cosa Nostra, then the decision that would ultimately seal Mattarella's fate was not based upon a single event. It resulted from the cumulative effect of his administration. Every reform added another source of tension. Every canceled project increased resentment. Every investigation expanded the risk faced by those benefiting from corruption. Viewed individually, each administrative decision formed part of ordinary government. Viewed collectively, they represented an attempt to transform the relationship between public institutions and organized crime. That transformation carried enormous consequences. By the beginning of 1980, Piersanti Mattarella had become one of Italy's most prominent political figures associated with efforts to reduce mafia influence within government. His position as president of the Sicilian region gave both symbolic and practical importance to his actions. Success would demonstrate that regional institutions could function independently of criminal pressure. Failure would send a very different message. Whether he fully understood the extent of the danger surrounding him is impossible to determine from the available evidence. What is clear is that, according to later testimony, influential figures within Cosa Nostra had already reached the conclusion that his continued leadership threatened interests they considered essential. The ordinary Sunday morning that began on January 6, 1980, therefore marked not the beginning of the story, but its culmination. The attack waiting outside his home was the violent endpoint of a conflict that had developed through policy decisions, administrative reforms, and an increasingly determined effort to separate Sicily's government from the influence of organized crime. In only a few moments, that conflict would leave the realm of political struggle and become one of the most significant murder investigations in Italy's modern history. By the morning of Sunday, January 6, 1980, there was nothing outwardly unusual about the beginning of Piersanti Mattarella's day. Palermo was observing the Feast of the Epiphany, one of the most significant religious celebrations in Italy. Across the city, families were preparing to attend church before gathering together for the remainder of the holiday. It was a day traditionally associated with faith, family, and quiet routine. For the Mattarella family, the morning appeared no different. There were no scheduled political engagements, no official ceremonies, and no indication that history was about to take a tragic turn. After completing the ordinary preparations for leaving home, Piersanti Mattarella got behind the wheel of his Fiat 132. Seated inside the vehicle with him were his wife, his daughter, and his mother-in-law. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. It was simply a family preparing to attend church together. The Fiat began to move away from the residence in Palermo. What happened next unfolded in only a matter of moments. Yet those moments would permanently alter the course of Italy's fight against organized crime. As the car had only just departed, a man approached the driver's side. According to the established facts of the investigation, he was armed with a .38 caliber handgun. The distance between the attacker and his target was extremely short. There was no lengthy confrontation, no exchange of words preserved in the historical record, and no opportunity for escape. The gunman moved directly toward the driver's door and opened fire from point-blank range. Multiple shots struck Piersanti Mattarella. The bullets hit his head and chest, causing devastating injuries. The attack demonstrated a level of precision that investigators would later consider significant. The shooting was completed rapidly, suggesting preparation rather than improvisation. The assassin did not remain at the scene. Immediately after firing the shots, he fled toward a waiting getaway vehicle where an accomplice was prepared to drive away. Within seconds, both men had disappeared from the immediate area, leaving behind only the sound of gunfire, a wounded public official, and stunned witnesses struggling to understand what had just occurred. Inside the Fiat, chaos replaced what had only moments earlier been a peaceful family journey. Mattarella's wife, daughter, and mother-in-law suddenly found themselves at the center of an act of extraordinary violence. Their intended trip to church had become a desperate struggle against time. The attack had not only targeted one of Sicily's highest-ranking political leaders, it had unfolded directly in front of the members of his own family. The emotional shock of witnessing such violence is impossible to measure fully through official records alone. What remains historically certain is that the assassination occurred while those closest to him were present in the vehicle, transforming an ordinary family mourning into an unforgettable tragedy. News of the shooting spread almost immediately. Among those who rushed toward the scene was Piersanti Mattarella's younger brother, Sergio Mattarella. When he arrived, he found his brother gravely wounded inside the vehicle. In a desperate attempt to save him, Sergio tried to pull Piersanti from the driver's seat so that he could receive medical assistance as quickly as possible. The urgency of those moments reflected the natural instinct of a brother refusing to surrender hope, even in circumstances that were rapidly becoming irreversible. Despite those efforts, the injuries proved fatal. Piersanti Mattarella died shortly afterward. His death marked the end of a political career dedicated, according to the evidence later examined by investigators, to reforming Sicily's institutions and reducing the influence of organized crime within regional government. Yet while his life ended that morning, the consequences of his assassination were only beginning. One image from the immediate aftermath would come to symbolize far more than personal grief. A photograph captured Sergio Mattarella supporting his wounded brother beside the vehicle. Over the years, that photograph became one of the defining visual records of Italy's struggle against the mafia. Unlike courtroom documents or investigative reports, a single photograph communicates emotion without explanation. It showed not a political office, not a government institution, and not the abstract concept of organized crime. It showed a family confronting irreversible loss. Decades later, the image would continue to represent the human cost of violence committed in pursuit of criminal power. At the time of the assassination, however, almost none of the larger questions had answers. Investigators knew only the immediate facts. A prominent regional politician had been shot at close range while leaving home. The attacker had escaped successfully with the assistance of at least one accomplice. The operation appeared carefully organized. Beyond those observations, uncertainty dominated every aspect of the case. Who had planned the attack? Why had it been carried out on that particular morning? Had the killers selected a religious holiday because they knew Mattarella's routine? Or had they simply chosen the first available opportunity? The available evidence at the scene could not answer those questions. The professionalism of the assault immediately attracted attention. It had been executed with remarkable speed. The gunman approached confidently, fired accurately, and escaped before any meaningful intervention could occur. Such efficiency suggested preparation. Investigators would later consider whether the methods used resembled those employed by terrorists, organizations active during Italy's years of lead. Others would eventually argue that the operation reflected the disciplined methods traditionally associated with organized crime. At that early stage, however, neither possibility could be confirmed. The attack itself had produced few immediate clues regarding those responsible. As authorities began collecting evidence, the assassination quickly attracted national attention. Piersanti Mattarella was not an obscure local official. He served as president of the Sicilian region, making him one of the most prominent political figures on the island. His killing, therefore, extended beyond the boundaries of Palermo. It raised concerns throughout Italy about political violence, institutional security, and the ability of democratic government to protect public officials. The murder also carried symbolic significance. Public assassinations are intended not only to eliminate individuals, but also to send messages. Although investigators had not yet determined the motive, the selection of such a high-profile target inevitably suggested that the crime was designed to have consequences extending far beyond one family. Whoever organized the attack had chosen to strike a senior elected official in broad daylight while he was accompanied by his loved ones. The boldness of that decision demonstrated confidence that the operation could succeed despite the public nature of the setting. For the Mattarella family, however, the broader political implications remained secondary to immediate grief. Their husband, father, brother, and relative had left home expecting nothing more extraordinary than attending church. Instead, within moments of entering his car, he had become the victim of a carefully executed assassination. The simplicity of that sequence has remained one of the most haunting aspects of the case. There was no prolonged confrontation. There was no opportunity for negotiation. There was only a routine departure from home, interrupted by sudden violence. In the days that followed, investigators faced the difficult task of reconstructing events that had unfolded with extraordinary speed. Witness statements, forensic examinations, and the circumstances surrounding the escape would all become essential components of the inquiry. Yet the apparent efficiency of the attack meant that the killers had left little behind. Every unanswered question increased the complexity of the investigation. Why had the operation been carried out with such precision? Who possessed the resources to organize an assassination of this nature? Was the killing connected to Italy's wider climate of political violence? Or did it originate from an entirely different source of power operating beneath Sicily's public institutions? These uncertainties shaped the earliest stages of the investigation. At that moment, authorities had not yet reached the conclusions that history now associates with the case. They had not yet heard the testimony of former mafia members who would eventually describe decisions made within Cosa Nostra. They had not yet identified the competing theories that would divide investigators. They had not yet discovered that different witnesses would later name different gunmen, leaving one of the central questions unresolved for decades. All they possessed was the undeniable reality of what had occurred on a quiet Sunday morning. A respected political leader had been murdered in front of his family. The attackers had escaped. The motive remained uncertain. The investigation had only just begun. In the years ahead, that investigation would travel through conflicting theories, unexpected testimony, courtroom battles, and decades of judicial examination. It would eventually establish responsibility at the highest levels of organized crime while continuing to leave one crucial mystery unanswered. But on January 6th, 1980, none of that was yet visible. There was only the silence that follows gunfire, the grief of a family whose ordinary morning had ended in tragedy, and the beginning of one of the most significant criminal investigations in modern Italian history. The murder of Piersanti Mattarella immediately became one of the highest-profile criminal investigations in Italy. A senior regional leader had been shot at point-blank range in front of his family on a public street in Palermo, and the attack had been executed with remarkable speed. Yet despite the prominence of the victim, investigators did not begin with clear answers. They were confronted with a crime scene that demonstrated planning and professionalism, but offered few immediate clues about those responsible. The assassin had approached, fired multiple shots with a .38 caliber handgun, escaped into a waiting vehicle driven by an accomplice, and disappeared within moments. That efficiency shaped the earliest assumptions of the investigation. Detectives were not simply searching for a lone killer. They were looking for an organization capable of planning and carrying out a coordinated political assassination. In the first phase of the inquiry, investigators examined a possibility that reflected the broader climate of Italy at the time. The country was living through the years of lead, a period marked by political violence, bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations committed by extremist organizations from both the far left and the far right. Public officials had repeatedly become targets of ideological violence. Against that national background, the assassination of the president of the Sicilian region naturally appeared capable of fitting the same pattern. Several aspects of the attack seemed to support this initial direction. The operation had been executed with discipline. The gunman had displayed confidence, approaching his target directly before firing accurately from close range. The escape had been carefully coordinated, suggesting preparation rather than improvisation. Witnesses who observed the attacker offered descriptions that led some investigators to consider the possibility that the shooter resembled members of far-right extremist groups active during that era. While eyewitness testimony is rarely perfect, those early descriptions became part of the developing investigative picture. At that stage, authorities could not rule out the involvement of political terrorism. Consequently, considerable attention was devoted to examining extremist organizations operating during the years of lead. Investigators sought to determine whether the assassination formed part of a broader campaign of political violence that had already claimed numerous victims across Italy. The possibility appeared plausible enough to justify substantial investigative resources. Yet plausibility alone is never sufficient in a criminal investigation. Every theory must ultimately withstand evidence. As the inquiry progressed, one of the magistrates who examined the case was Giovanni Falcone. In later years, Falcone would become internationally recognized for his relentless pursuit of Cosa Nostra. But during the investigation into Mottarella's murder, he approached the evidence with characteristic caution, rather than accepting the first available explanation. He examined alternative possibilities that might account for the circumstances of the assassination. One hypothesis considered by Falcone was particularly significant. He explored the possibility that organized crime might have employed individuals associated with far-right extremism to carry out the murder. Such an arrangement, if it had existed, could have served two purposes simultaneously. First, it would eliminate a political figure regarded as dangerous by organized crime. Second, it could divert investigators toward extremist organizations instead of the mafia, delaying or complicating efforts to identify those who had ordered the assassination. The theory reflected an important principle of criminal investigation. The apparent identity of the attacker is not always the same as the identity of those directing the crime. Nevertheless, examining a theory is not the same as proving it. Despite the attention devoted to extremist suspects, the available evidence ultimately failed to establish criminal responsibility. The individuals investigated under that line of inquiry were eventually acquitted because the evidence was insufficient to sustain convictions. Their acquittals marked a significant turning point. An important investigative avenue had been explored, yet it had not produced a legally sustainable explanation for the assassination. The case therefore remained unresolved. The identity of those responsible continued to elude investigators, and the motive behind the murder remained uncertain. As months passed and then years followed, the investigation entered a different phase. Rather than relying primarily upon forensic evidence and eyewitness testimony, authorities gradually gained access to an entirely new source of information. That source came from within Cosa Nostra itself. During Italy's expanding campaign against organized crime, certain former mafia members chose to cooperate with judicial authorities. These individuals became known as pentiti, former members who agreed to provide testimony regarding the internal operations of the organization. Their cooperation transformed numerous mafia investigations, allowing prosecutors to understand decision-making processes that had previously remained hidden behind strict codes of secrecy. Among the most influential pentiti were Tommaso Buscetta and Francesco Marino Minoia. Their testimony would fundamentally alter the direction of the Mattarella investigation. Rather than describing the assassination as an act of political extremism, both men identified it as a decision originating within the highest levels of Cosa Nostra. According to their accounts, the killing had not been ordered by a single local criminal acting independently. Instead, they stated that the assassination had been approved collectively by the Sicilian Mafia Commission, the body through which senior mafia leaders coordinated decisions affecting the organization as a whole. This testimony shifted the investigation from the search for isolated perpetrators toward an examination of institutional responsibility within organized crime. If the pentiti were correct, the murder represented not an individual initiative, but an officially sanctioned operation carried out in defense of mafia interests. According to their statements, the decision to eliminate Piersanti Mattarella reflected the growing concern among Cosa Nostra leaders that his reforms threatened their influence over public contracts, construction projects, infrastructure investments, and regional funding. The testimonies identified several senior figures alleged to have participated in approving the assassination. Among the names repeatedly associated with that decision were Stefano Bontad, Salvatore Inzerillo, Salvatore Rina, Bernardo Provenzano, Michele Greco, and other leading members of the Sicilian Mafia Commission. Their alleged involvement suggested that the assassination had been considered significant enough to require collective authorization rather than the decision of a single family or local commander. This interpretation also corresponded with the political importance of the victim. Piersanti Mattarella was not merely another public official. As president of the Sicilian region, his reforms affected systems of economic influence extending across the island. According to the pentiti, eliminating him therefore required approval at the highest organizational level. Yet, even as the testimony clarified who had allegedly ordered the crime, another mystery remained stubbornly unresolved. Who had actually pulled the trigger? On this crucial question, the accounts of the cooperating witnesses diverged. Francesco Marino Minoia identified one group of alleged participants. According to his testimony, the assassination team included Salvatore Federico, Francesco Davi, Santo Inzerillo, and Antonio Rotolo. His account described these individuals as forming the operational group responsible for carrying out the attack. Tommaso Buscetta, however, provided a different version. Rather than naming the same individuals, Buscetta identified Nino Madonia, Vincenzo Puccio, and Pippo Gambino. His testimony therefore conflicted with Minoia's regarding the composition of the assassination team. These differences presented investigators with a significant evidentiary challenge. Both witnesses were important insiders with direct knowledge of Cosa Nostra, yet their accounts could not be fully reconciled. They agreed on the broader conclusion that the Mafia Commission had ordered the assassination, but they disagreed concerning the identity of those who executed it. Such inconsistencies are not uncommon in investigations relying upon cooperating witnesses. Individuals may possess different sources of information, varying degrees of direct involvement, or incomplete knowledge regarding operational details. Nevertheless, criminal courts require evidence capable of establishing guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Divergent testimony, standing alone, cannot always satisfy that standard. Investigators therefore searched for corroborating evidence that might resolve the contradiction. Physical evidence capable of identifying the shooter, however, remained insufficient. The crime scene had yielded no definitive forensic proof establishing which individual had fired the fatal shots. As the years passed, technological advances raised hopes that preserved evidence might eventually provide the missing answers. Even decades after the assassination, authorities continued examining materials retained from the investigation. In 2025 and 2026, renewed investigative efforts included modern DNA analysis of preserved evidence and physical exhibits associated with the case. These examinations reflected both advances in forensic science and a continuing determination of Italian authorities to resolve every remaining uncertainty surrounding one of the country's most important political murders. Expectations were understandably cautious. Modern forensic techniques have solved numerous cold cases previously considered impossible to resolve. There was hope that scientific analysis might finally identify the individual responsible for firing the weapon on that January morning in Palermo. Yet the renewed investigation ultimately produced another disappointment. The available material did not contain usable DNA capable of identifying the gunman. The forensic re-examinations therefore failed to answer the question that had remained unresolved for decades. The investigation had succeeded in establishing much about the structure behind the assassination. According to the judicial findings supported by Pentito testimony, responsibility for ordering the murder pointed toward the leadership of Cosa Nostra. But identifying the individual who physically carried out the shooting remained beyond the reach of the available evidence. In many criminal investigations, uncertainty surrounds motive while the identity of the killer is clear. The Mattarella case evolved in the opposite direction. Over time, investigators became increasingly confident regarding the institutional motive and the alleged decision-making process behind the assassination. Yet the final operational detail, the identity of the man standing beside the driver's door with the .38 caliber handgun, continued to resist definitive proof. This unusual combination of certainty and uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The investigation demonstrated remarkable progress over many years, moving from initial suspicion of political extremism to detailed allegations concerning the leadership of Cosa Nostra. It uncovered testimony describing how decisions were allegedly made within the Mafia Commission and why Mattarella had come to be regarded as a threat. At the same time, it also revealed the limitations that investigators sometimes face even after decades of persistent work. Witnesses may disagree. Physical evidence may deteriorate or prove inconclusive. Scientific advances may arrive too late to compensate for evidence that no longer exists. By the conclusion of the investigative phase, the direction of the case had changed completely from where it began. Authorities no longer viewed the assassination primarily through the lens of political terrorism. Instead, they increasingly regarded it as a deliberate act carried out to protect the interests of Cosa Nostra against a regional leader whose reforms threatened established systems of influence. The investigation had uncovered the broader architecture of the crime. What remained was the task of presenting that evidence before the courts, determining criminal responsibility for those alleged to have ordered the assassination, and confronting the difficult legal questions that still surrounded one of Italy's most consequential murders. By the time the investigation into the assassination of Piersanti Mattarella reached the courtroom, many years had passed since the gunfire that had shattered the quiet morning of January 6, 1980. The passage of time had transformed the case. What had begun as an inquiry clouded by uncertainty, conflicting theories, and limited physical evidence had gradually evolved through years of judicial work, witness testimony, and the cooperation of former mafia members. The investigation had not followed a straight path. It had moved from early suspicion of political extremism to an increasingly detailed picture of an organized decision allegedly made within the leadership of Cosa Nostra. Yet even as prosecutors prepared their case, one reality remained unchanged. Identifying the individual who had physically fired the fatal shots continued to prove extraordinarily difficult. The challenge facing the courts was therefore broader than determining the identity of a single gunman. Prosecutors sought to establish responsibility for those who had allegedly conceived, authorized, and directed the assassination itself. In cases involving organized crime, criminal responsibility often extends beyond the individual who carries out the violence. Those who order, approve, or coordinate a murder may bear equal or greater legal responsibility than the person who ultimately pulls the trigger. The Mattarella case reflected precisely that principle. Years of investigation had produced testimony suggesting that the assassination was not the isolated decision of one criminal acting alone, but the result of collective deliberation among the highest leadership of the Sicilian Mafia. The judicial process, therefore, focused on determining whether sufficient evidence existed to prove that conclusion before the law. Central to the prosecution's case was the testimony provided by the Pentiti, former members of Cosa Nostra who had decided to cooperate with Italian authorities. Among the most influential witnesses were Tommaso Buscetta and Francesco Marino Manoia. Their cooperation had already transformed the investigation itself by redirecting attention toward the Sicilian Mafia Commission. Before their testimony, investigators had explored alternative explanations, including the possible involvement of far-right extremist groups active during Italy's years of lead. Those theories had ultimately failed to produce convictions because the available evidence proved insufficient. The testimony of the Pentiti introduced an entirely different framework. Rather than portraying the assassination as an act of ideological terrorism, they described it as a calculated organizational decision intended to eliminate a political leader whose reforms threatened important mafia interests. Their statements alleged that Piersanti Mattarella had become a serious obstacle because of his efforts to increase transparency in public procurement, reduce mafia influence within the construction industry, reform planning regulations, investigate corruption, cancel suspicious public projects, and remove organized crime from regional institutions. According to their accounts, these actions endangered financial interests connected to public contracts, infrastructure investments, housing developments, and regional funding. The alleged response from Cosa Nostra was not impulsive retaliation, but a deliberate decision taken at the highest level of the organization. The testimony indicated that the Sicilian Mafia Commission had collectively approved the assassination. Prosecutors therefore argued that responsibility rested not merely with the operational participants, but with those senior leaders who had authorized the crime. The alleged members of the commission identified through the investigation included Stefano Bontad, Salvatore Inzerillo, Salvatore Rina, Bernardo Provenzano, Michele Greco, and other influential mafia figures. Their names reflected the concentration of authority within Cosa Nostra during that period. According to the prosecution's theory, the murder of a regional president represented an action of such significance that it required collective approval rather than the initiative of a single mafia family. While the prosecution presented this organizational structure as the framework behind the assassination, another issue continued to complicate the proceedings. The identity of the gunman remained disputed. Francesco Marino Manoia and Tommaso Bissetta agreed that the murder had been ordered by the leadership of Cosa Nostra. Yet they differed regarding the composition of the assassination team. Manoia identified Salvatore Federico, Francisco Davi, Santo Inzerillo, and Antonio Rotolo as the individuals involved in carrying out the operation. Bissetta instead named Nino Madonia, Vincenzo Puccio, and Pippo Gambino. These differences were significant. Criminal trials require careful evaluation of witness credibility, particularly when testimony originates from cooperating former members of criminal organizations. Divergent accounts do not necessarily invalidate broader conclusions, but they complicate efforts to attribute specific operational roles to individual defendants. The courts therefore faced the task of distinguishing between questions that could be resolved beyond reasonable doubt and those that remained uncertain because of conflicting evidence. This distinction would ultimately shape the judicial outcome. The evidence presented was considered sufficient to support conclusions regarding who had ordered the assassination, but it did not establish with the same degree of certainty the identity of the individual who had physically fired the weapon. The legal process therefore concentrated on the chain of command rather than the unresolved question of the triggerman. That approach reflected the nature of organized crime prosecutions, where criminal responsibility frequently depends upon proving collective planning and authorization rather than identifying every participant in the operational phase. The years of investigation and courtroom proceedings eventually led to one of the most significant judicial milestones in the history of the case. In 1995, several senior members of Cosa Nostra were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for ordering the assassination of Piersanti Mattarella. Among those convicted were Salvatore Rina, Michele Greco, Bernardo Provenzano, Pippo Callo, Bernardo Brusca, Antonino Geraci, Francesco Madonia, together with other members of the Sicilian Mafia Commission. These convictions represented a major affirmation of the prosecution's central argument. The courts concluded that the assassination had been the product of a collective decision made by the leadership of Cosa Nostra. Although many years had elapsed since the murder, the judicial findings established that responsibility extended to the organization's highest levels. The verdicts carried importance beyond the punishment of individual defendants. They formally recognized the assassination as an organized act designed to protect the mafia's interests against a political leader pursuing institutional reform. In doing so, the judgments reinforced the conclusions that investigators had gradually assembled through years of painstaking work. At the same time, the courts carefully acknowledged the limits of the available evidence. Although the convictions established responsibility for ordering the assassination, they did not resolve every remaining uncertainty. The identity of the person who had stood beside the driver's door of the Fiat 132 and fired the fatal shots remained undetermined by a definitive judicial finding. Competing witness accounts and the absence of conclusive physical evidence prevented the courts from reaching the same level of certainty regarding the operational execution of the crime. This unusual outcome meant that the case was, in one sense, judicially resolved while remaining incomplete in another. The chain of command had been identified and punished. The final link in the chain, the individual assassin, remained uncertain. Alongside the criminal proceedings concerning Cosa Nostra, another issue emerged that attracted considerable public attention because it involved one of Italy's most prominent political figures. During later stages of the broader investigations into mafia influence, witnesses alleged that former Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti had been aware of growing hostility within Cosa Nostra toward Pier Santi Mattarella and had attempted unsuccessfully to prevent the assassination. These allegations inevitably generated widespread interest because they touched upon the relationship between organized crime and national politics. The judicial treatment of these claims, however, was careful and specific. Andreotti was tried in proceedings concerning his historical relationship with Cosa Nostra. The courts concluded that evidence demonstrated contacts with the organization before 1980. Nevertheless, they did not convict him in connection with the murder of Pier Santi Mattarella. The legal reasons were clearly defined. The applicable statute of limitations had expired regarding certain historical conduct, and the available evidence was insufficient to establish criminal responsibility for Mattarella's assassination itself. This distinction is important. The judicial findings concerning Andreotti did not alter the conclusions already reached regarding the organization of the murder by Cosa Nostra, nor did they establish his criminal liability for the assassination. Instead, they illustrated the complexity of investigating relationships between political figures and organized crime while maintaining the legal standards required for criminal conviction. As the trials concluded, the Mattarella case occupied a distinctive place in Italian legal history. It demonstrated that even the most powerful leaders of Cosa Nostra could be held accountable through patient investigation, witness cooperation, and sustained judicial effort. At the same time, it reminded observers that criminal justice does not always answer every historical question. Courts are limited by the evidence presented before them. Where evidence is insufficient, uncertainty must remain, regardless of public suspicion or historical speculation. In the case of Pier Santi Mattarella, the judicial process succeeded in establishing one fundamental conclusion. His assassination had been ordered through the collective decision-making structure of the Sicilian Mafia Commission. That finding transformed public understanding of the crime and confirmed that the murder had been intended to eliminate a political leader whose reforms threatened organized criminal interests. Yet another question survived every investigation, every witness statement, and every courtroom proceeding. Who was the man who actually pulled the trigger on that quiet Sunday morning in Palermo? The courts could not answer it with final certainty. The evidence simply did not permit such a conclusion. This combination of decisive convictions and enduring uncertainty became one of the defining features of the case. Justice had established institutional responsibility while leaving one final mystery unresolved. The verdicts close an important legal chapter, but they did not bring complete historical closure. Instead, they marked the transition from judicial accountability to a broader national reflection on what the assassination of Pier Santi Mattarella had come to represent, not only for Sicily, but for Italy's continuing struggle against the power of organized crime. When the courtroom proceedings reached their conclusions, the legal record had answered many of the questions that had emerged on the morning of January 6, 1980. The investigations had moved beyond the uncertainty that initially surrounded the assassination. The early suspicion directed toward far-right extremist groups had ultimately given way to a different understanding of the crime. Through years of investigation, the testimony of former mafia members, and lengthy judicial proceedings, the courts concluded that the murder of Pier Santi Mattarella had been ordered by the leadership of Cosa Nostra. Several senior figures within the Sicilian Mafia Commission received life sentences for authorizing the assassination. Yet, even with those judgments, the case never became one of complete certainty. One question remained unanswered. The identity of the individual who fired the fatal shots into the driver's side of the Fiat 132 was never established by a definitive judicial ruling. That unresolved detail has remained part of the historical record ever since. In many criminal cases, uncertainty fades as evidence accumulates and trials conclude. The Mattarella case followed a different path. The broader conspiracy became increasingly clear over time, while the identity of the triggerman remained uncertain. It is this combination of clarity and mystery that continues to distinguish the assassination. Decades later, the courts were able to determine who had ordered the crime, but history has not been able to identify with complete certainty who physically carried it out. Yet the significance of Pier Sandy Mottarella's death extends far beyond the unanswered identity of one assassin. Historians and legal scholars have consistently viewed his assassination as a defining moment in Italy's confrontation with organized crime. It represented more than the murder of a regional political leader. It demonstrated that efforts to reform public institutions and reduce mafia influence could provoke violent retaliation from an organization determined to preserve its economic and political power. Before his death, Mottarella had pursued reforms intended to make public administration more transparent. He had sought to reduce the influence of organized crime over construction contracts, infrastructure investment, public housing projects, and regional funding. According to the testimony later accepted by the courts, these reforms threatened financial interests that Cosa Nostra regarded as essential. His assassination, therefore, became a powerful illustration of the risks faced by public officials who challenged entrenched criminal systems. The consequences reached well beyond Sicily. The murder served as a warning that organized crime was prepared to use violence not only against rival criminals, but also against elected representatives attempting to strengthen public institutions. At the same time, the national reaction to the assassination demonstrated that such violence would not remain hidden or ignored. Instead, the killing became one of the events that intensified Italy's determination to confront Cosa Nostra through the legal system rather than accommodation or silence. In the years that followed, Italy's campaign against organized crime continued to expand. Among the central figures in that struggle were Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. Falcone had already played an important role in examining the investigation into Mottarella's murder, carefully evaluating competing theories before evidence redirected attention toward Cosa Nostra. Both Falcone and Borsellino would continue pursuing the fight against the mafia through judicial investigation and prosecution. Their commitment would ultimately cost them their lives, as both men were later assassinated by Cosa Nostra. Their deaths reinforced the reality already demonstrated by the murder of Pier Sandy Mottarella. Confronting organized crime in Sicily demanded extraordinary courage and often carried extraordinary personal risk. Seen together, these assassinations form part of a larger historical narrative. They reveal an extended conflict between democratic institutions seeking to enforce the rule of law and a criminal organization attempting to preserve influence through intimidation and violence. Within that history, the murder of Mottarella occupies a crucial position. It marked an early and unmistakable indication that reforming public institutions could provoke a direct response from organized crime at the highest level. Equally important is the human dimension of the case. Discussions of organized crime often focus on criminal organizations, court proceedings, investigations, or political consequences. Yet the center of every homicide is an individual life abruptly interrupted. On the morning of January 6, 1980, Pier Sandy Mottarella was not attending a political rally or participating in a public demonstration. He was leaving home with his wife, daughter, and mother-in-law to attend church. That ordinary family routine ended within seconds. The simplicity of those circumstances has remained one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Violence arrived not during a dramatic confrontation, but in the middle of an ordinary Sunday morning. The image of Sergio Mottarella attempting to save his wounded brother continues to symbolize that deeply personal tragedy. Long before Sergio Mottarella would become president of Italy in 2015, he experienced the loss of his brother in one of the country's most consequential political assassinations. The photograph taken beside the Fiat 132 has endured because it captures more than a historical event. It captures grief at the precise moment when public history and private loss became inseparable. Decades passed, but the investigation itself never entirely disappeared. Advances in forensic science encouraged renewed efforts to answer the questions that earlier generations of investigators have been unable to resolve. By 2025 and 2026, Italian authorities reopened investigative avenues using modern techniques unavailable at the time of the original inquiry. Preserved evidence and physical exhibits were subjected to renewed examination, including DNA analysis. The hope was straightforward. Scientific progress had solved numerous cold cases around the world by identifying suspects through biological evidence that earlier investigators could neither detect nor analyze. Perhaps after so many years, the final mystery surrounding the Mattarella assassination could finally be resolved. Yet science, like the law, is limited by the evidence that survives. The renewed forensic examinations ultimately failed to produce usable DNA capable of identifying the gunman. The passage of time, the condition of preserved evidence, and the realities of forensic investigation meant that the hope for breakthrough never arrived. The result was both disappointing and revealing. It demonstrated that even the most advanced scientific methods cannot always overcome the limitations created by history itself. Some questions persist, not because investigators lack determination, but because the available evidence no longer permits definitive answers. Consequently, the murder of Piersanti Mattarella remains both one of Italy's best documented mafia assassinations and one of its enduring mysteries. The judicial record firmly establishes that senior leaders of Cosa Nostra ordered the crime. It explains the institutional motives behind the assassination and identifies the broader organizational structure responsible for authorizing it. At the same time, the identity of the individual who fired the weapon remains uncertain because competing witness testimony was never supported by conclusive physical evidence. That distinction is important. History sometimes demands acceptance that certainty exists on some questions while remaining impossible on others. The absence of a definitive answer regarding the gunman does not erase the broader conclusions established through decades of investigation, nor does it diminish the significance of Mattarella's efforts to reform Sicily's institutions or the impact of his death upon Italy's struggle against organized crime. Instead, it serves as a reminder that justice is often a gradual process rather than a single moment. Some truths emerge quickly. Others require years of patient investigation. Some are established beyond reasonable doubt. Others remain permanently beyond complete certainty. The assassination of Piersanti Mattarella embodies all of those realities. Looking back today, nearly half a century after that quiet Sunday morning in Palermo, it is possible to see the case from two perspectives at once. One perspective is historical. It recognizes the assassination as a pivotal event that foreshadowed the escalating confrontation between the Italian state and Cosa Nostra throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The other perspective is deeply personal. It remembers a husband, a father, a brother, and a public servant whose life ended while carrying out one of the simplest routines imaginable, leaving home with his family to attend church. The passage of time has transformed the crime into an important chapter in Italy's legal and political history. Yet it has never removed its human dimension. Every investigation, every courtroom proceeding, every forensic examination, and every renewed inquiry has ultimately returned to the same moment. A family journey interrupted by violence. A reformer whose work threatened powerful criminal interests. And a nation forced to confront the reality that organized crime was willing to murder an elected leader to protect its influence. The courts have spoken. The investigations have reached their limits. Modern science has been given its opportunity. Still, one final silence remains where certainty should have been. The man who stood beside the driver's door on January 6, 1980, raised a .38 caliber handgun, fired the shots that killed Piersanti Mattarella, and disappeared into history without being conclusively identified. Yet perhaps the lasting importance of this case lies elsewhere. The assassination did not preserve the secrecy or power that its organizers may have intended to protect. Instead, it became one of the defining moments that strengthened Italy's resolve to investigate, prosecute, and expose the inner workings of Cosa Nostra. In that sense, while one name remains unknown, the legacy of Piersanti Mattarella endures with remarkable clarity. His death became more than the conclusion of a single life. It became part of the long and difficult history of a nation choosing to confront organized crime through law, persistence, and the enduring belief that public institutions must never surrender to fear. In the years following the conviction of senior members of Cosa Nostra for the assassination of Piersanti Mattarella, the case gradually settled into an unusual position within Italian legal and political history. It was no longer an active investigation in the traditional sense. It was never fully closed in the way that other historical crimes are considered resolved. Instead, it existed in a space between certainty and incompleteness, where key conclusions have been firmly established by the courts, while one essential detail remained permanently out of reach. The judicial record made one central point unmistakably clear. The murder of Piersanti Mattarella was not an isolated act of violence, nor the work of a single criminal or fringe group acting independently. It was, according to the findings of Italian courts in 1995, the result of a collective decision taken within the highest levels of the Sicilian Mafia Commission. Figures such as Salvatore Riina, Michele Greco, Bernardo Provenzano, and others were convicted for their role in authorizing the assassination. This legal conclusion anchored the case within a broader historical understanding of how Cosa and Nostra operated during that period, not as a loose network of disconnected families, but as a structured organization capable of coordinated strategic decisions against the Italian state. Yet even as this institutional responsibility became part of the historical record, another layer of uncertainty persisted. The courtroom proceedings, shaped by years of pentito testimony and investigative reconstruction, had succeeded in identifying the chain of command behind the assassination. They had explained why Mattarella was targeted, how his reforms threatened entrenched systems of corruption, and why senior mafia leadership viewed him as an obstacle to their economic interests in public procurement, construction, infrastructure, and regional administration. What they could not conclusively determine was the identity of the man who physically carried out the attack on that January morning in Palermo. This unresolved detail gradually became one of the defining features of the case. Competing testimonies from former mafia insiders, including figures such as Tommaso Bissetta and Francesco Marino Manoia, provided overlapping but inconsistent accounts of the operational team. Some named Salvatore Federico, Francesco Davi, Santo Inzerillo, and Antonio Rotolo. Others pointed instead to Nino Madonia, Vincenzo Puccio, and Pippo Gambino. These contradictions were not unusual in cases built on insider testimony from criminal organizations, where memory, access, hierarchy, and partial knowledge often shaped what each witness could truthfully describe. However, in the absence of corroborating physical evidence capable of resolving these discrepancies, the courts were left unable to establish a single definitive version of the shooting itself. Over time, the absence of that final identification took on symbolic weight. It reflected the broader difficulties faced by states confronting deeply embedded organized crime structures. where operational secrecy, intimidation, and the passage of time often erode the evidentiary foundation needed for absolute certainty. Even the introduction of modern forensic methods decades later, including renewed DNA analysis of preserved evidence in 2025 to 2026, did not produce the breakthrough that investigators had hoped for. The biological traces that might have once linked a specific individual to the weapon or crime scene were either absent, degraded, or insufficient for identification. In this sense, the Mattarella case became a reminder of the limits of retrospective justice. While courts were able to reconstruct the decision-making architecture behind the assassination with a high degree of confidence, they could not fully recover every operational detail of the crime itself. Time had already done its work, not only in the physical deterioration of evidence, but in the irreversible loss of certain forms of knowledge that only exist in the immediate aftermath of events. And yet, despite this incompleteness, the impact of the case did not diminish. If anything, its significance deepened over time. The assassination of Pier Santi Mattarella is now widely understood as a turning point in Italy's confrontation with Cosa Nostra. It marked a moment when the conflict between reforming state institutions and entrenched criminal power became unmistakably visible. His efforts to introduce transparency in public procurement, reduce mafia influence over construction and infrastructure projects, and align Sicily's administrative practices with broader national standards placed him in direct opposition to systems that had long operated with relative impunity. The reaction to those reforms, as later confirmed through judicial findings and cooperating testimony, demonstrated the extent to which organized crime had become intertwined with regional economic structures. The decision to eliminate a sitting regional president was not simply an act of violence. It was an assertion of power intended to protect those structures from disruption. In that sense, the assassination revealed not only the vulnerability of individual officials, but also the broader stakes involved in institutional reform within environments shaped by organized criminal influence. For Italy as a whole, the aftermath of Mattarella's death contributed to a growing recognition that the struggle against Cosa Nostra required sustained institutional commitment rather than episodic enforcement. The years that followed saw intensified judicial efforts, expanded investigative frameworks, and the emergence of magistrates such as Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, whose work would later define an entire era of anti-mafia prosecution. Their efforts were shaped, in part, by the same structural realities that had made Mattarella a target: the need to confront not only individual crimes, but the organizational systems that enabled them. Within this broader historical trajectory, Sergio Mattarella's presence adds a further dimension of continuity. As the younger brother of the assassinated president, he witnessed firsthand the immediate aftermath of the attack. Decades later, his own role as president of Italy places him within a national narrative that has long been shaped by the unresolved tensions between state authority and organized crime. While his public office is distinct from the events of 1980, the symbolic connection between personal loss and institutional responsibility has remained part of how the case is remembered in Italy's collective consciousness. Ultimately, the story of Pier Santi Mattarella does not conclude with a single moment of resolution. It concludes instead with a layered legacy. The courts established accountability at the level of those who ordered the crime. Investigations mapped the contours of a system in which political violence could be deployed to protect economic interests. History preserved the image of a family torn apart on an ordinary Sunday morning. And yet the identity of the individual who fired the final shots remains unknown. This combination of clarity and absence is what gives the case its lasting weight. It is not defined by a lack of answers, but by the coexistence of answers that are both definitive and incomplete. In the end, The assassination of Piersanti Mattarella stands as a record of what can be proven, what can be inferred, and what, even after decades of investigation, remains beyond reach. And in that unresolved space, between certainty and mystery, the case continues to speak, not only about the past of Sicily, but about the enduring challenges faced by any society confronting the hidden structures of organized power.